September 3rd, 1944, near Verdun, France, 2,300 hours. Major Victor Schramm of the Wehrmacht's operations staff stood on a hillside overlooking the main road from Chartres, his binoculars trembling in his hands. He had stopped counting after the first hour. There was no point in counting anymore. The headlights stretched to the horizon, an unbroken river of light, American trucks rolling east, bumper to bumper, 24 hours a day, their headlights blazing in open defiance of every principle of military concealment the German army held sacred. Schramm had been trained to move at night without lights, to camouflage supply columns, to disperse vehicles to prevent aerial attack. The Americans were driving with their headlights on, at night, in a combat zone, as if they were delivering groceries in peacetime Connecticut. "How many?" asked Oberstleutnant Brandt, his aide, who had climbed the hill to deliver a situation report and found his superior frozen in place, staring at the road below. Schramm lowered the binoculars. His voice was flat, drained of emotion. "I have watched this road for 3 hours. The trucks have not stopped. They have not slowed. I estimate one vehicle every 30 seconds. That is 120 vehicles per hour. In 3 hours, I have watched over 350 trucks pass this single point." He turned to Brandt. "And this is one road. Intelligence reports at least 4 parallel routes operating at similar capacity." Brandt said nothing. The mathematics required no elaboration. "We were told the Americans would outrun their supply lines," Schramm continued, his voice taking on a bitter edge. "We were told that Patton's tanks would stop when their fuel ran out, that the Americans could not sustain offensive operations more than 200 kilometers from their ports. Paris is over 400 kilometers from the beaches." He gestured at the endless procession of lights below. "Does that look like an army that has outrun its supplies?" What Major Schramm was witnessing, what German intelligence had completely failed to predict, was the largest truck convoy operation in military history. The Americans called it the Red Ball Express, named for the railroad term for priority freight. It was not supposed to exist. According to every logistical model the Wehrmacht possessed, according to every lesson learned from 4 years of mechanized warfare, the operation Schramm was watching should have been impossible. Patton's Third Army was consuming 800,000 gallons of fuel per day. His tanks were over 400 miles from the nearest major port. The French rail network had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombers and French resistance saboteurs. By every calculation German logistics officers had performed, the American advance should have ground to a halt somewhere around the Seine. Instead, the Americans had conjured an army of trucks out of thin air, 6,000 vehicles, organized into convoys that ran around the clock, delivering 12,500 tons of supplies every 24 hours across a one-way highway system that stretched from the Normandy beaches to the front lines. They had done it in 3 weeks. They had done it with vehicles driven so hard that tires blew out and engines seized and transmissions failed. And still they kept coming. The broken trucks pushed to the side of the road while fresh vehicles took their place. The river of supplies never stopping, never even slowing. The Germans had invented blitzkrieg. They had perfected the art of rapid, mechanized warfare. And they were about to learn that the Americans had perfected something even more important. They had perfected the art of keeping blitzkrieg fed. Major Schramm watched the lights until dawn. He submitted his report the following morning. It was forwarded to Army Group B headquarters, where it joined a growing pile of intelligence assessments that painted a picture German commanders refused to believe. They would believe it soon enough. Patton was coming, and thanks to the Red Ball Express, he wasn't stopping for anything. The German confidence in logistics was not arrogance. It was hard-won expertise, purchased with the blood of 3 campaigns. No army in history had studied the problem of supplying mobile warfare more intensively than the Wehrmacht. The blitzkrieg that had conquered Poland, France, and nearly conquered the Soviet Union depended entirely on the ability to keep tanks fueled, ammunition flowing, and soldiers fed while advancing at speeds that shattered conventional military thinking. German logistics officers had transformed supply from an afterthought into a science, calculating fuel consumption rates, truck tonnage requirements, and rail capacity with mathematical precision. And those calculations had revealed an iron law. Mechanized armies died when they outran their supplies. The lesson had been learned at Moscow in December 1941, when German panzers ground to a halt not because of Soviet resistance, but because fuel trucks couldn't reach them through the mud and snow. It had been reinforced at Stalingrad, where the Sixth Army starved in a pocket because the Luftwaffe couldn't fly in enough supplies to sustain 300,000 men. It had been confirmed in North Africa, where Rommel's brilliant tactical victories were rendered meaningless by the inability to ship enough fuel across the Mediterranean. War is logistics, General Oberst Alfred Jodl wrote in a 1943 strategic assessment. Tactics win battles, operations win campaigns, but logistics determines whether campaigns are possible at all. An army that advances beyond its supply lines is not advancing, it is dying. The Wehrmacht had built its entire defensive strategy in France around this principle. German planners knew they could not hold the Normandy beaches indefinitely against Allied air and naval superiority. The Atlantic Wall was a delaying action, designed to buy time while mobile reserves assembled for counterattack. But the deeper strategy, the strategy that senior commanders believed would save the Reich, was simpler: let the Allies advance, and let logistics destroy them. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, outlined the theory in a June 1944 briefing to his staff. The enemy will break out of the beachhead. This is inevitable given their material superiority, but their advance will create a supply crisis that no army can solve. The port of Cherbourg will be demolished before capture. The French rail network has been systematically destroyed. The Allies will be forced to supply their armies by truck over distances exceeding 300 kilometers, distances at which motor transport becomes unsustainable. The numbers supported Rundstedt's confidence. A standard U.S. Army infantry division consumed approximately 700 tons of supplies per day in active combat. An armored division, with its fuel-hungry tanks and half-tracks, consumed over 1,000 tons. By August 1944, the Allies had landed over 30 divisions in France. Simple multiplication revealed a requirement exceeding 25,000 tons of supplies per day, a figure that dwarfed the capacity of any truck-based logistics system in military history. The Americans face an impossible equation, wrote Oberst Heinrich Berker of the Wehrmacht's transportation staff in early August. They have captured Cherbourg, but we destroyed the port so thoroughly that it will not reach full capacity for months. They have no functional rail network east of Paris. Their only option is motor transport, and motor transport cannot deliver sufficient tonnage over the distances they must travel. We calculate that American offensive capability will degrade by 60% once their spearheads exceed 250 kilometers from the coast. At 400 kilometers, they will be forced to halt entirely. The calculation was elegant. The calculation was logical. The calculation was based on German experience, German doctrine, and the immutable physics of fuel consumption and cargo capacity. The calculation assumed the Americans would operate logistics the way any rational army would operate logistics. This assumption was about to prove catastrophically wrong. What German intelligence could not model, what no European military mind had ever contemplated, was an industrial democracy that had spent 2 decades perfecting mass production, mass transportation, and the logistical infrastructure to move goods across a continent. The Americans were not going to operate logistics like a rational army. They were going to operate logistics like General Motors operated an assembly line. And when the breakout from Normandy tore open the German lines in August 1944, the Wehrmacht was about to discover that the rules of logistics, the iron laws that had governed warfare since Napoleon, no longer applied. The Red Ball Express was born in a crisis, designed in 72 hours, and implemented by men who had never attempted anything like it before. On August 21, 1944, Colonel Laurent A. Groover of the Communication Zone, the sprawling logistics command responsible for supplying Allied forces in France, sat in a requisitioned schoolhouse near Chartres, staring at a map covered with red and blue grease pencil marks. The red marks showed Patton's Third Army, which had broken through German lines at Avranches 3 weeks earlier, and was now racing east at a speed that defied every logistical calculation Groover had ever performed. The blue marks showed supply depots still clustered near the Normandy beaches, 300 miles behind the front. Between the red and the blue was nothing but empty French countryside and a rail network that had been bombed into rubble. "We have 72 hours, Groover told his staff, his voice flat with exhaustion. After that, Third Army runs out of fuel. Patton stops. The Germans dig in, and everything we've gained in the last month turns into a siege line that lasts until spring." The problem was not merely distance, it was mathematics. The standard Army logistics model called for a supply chain built around railways, with trucks handling only the final miles from railhead to unit. This model assumed an intact rail network. France's rail network was 80% destroyed. The model assumed functional ports close to the front. Cherbourg, the only major port in Allied hands, was still operating at 40% capacity because German demolitions had blocked the harbor with sunken ships and destroyed cranes. The only option left was trucks, and trucks, according to every textbook Groover had ever read, could not sustain an army operating 400 miles from its base. "Then we throw away the textbooks," Groover said. What emerged from that schoolhouse over the next 3 days was an operation that violated every principle of military transportation. Groover and his staff designed a dedicated highway system, 2 parallel routes running from Saint-Lô near the beaches to Chartres near the front, eventually extending all the way to the German border. The routes would be one way, the northern road for loaded trucks heading east, the southern road for empty trucks returning west. No civilian traffic, no cross-traffic, no stopping except at designated rest areas. The highways were marked with red balls, the railroad term for express freight, painted on signs, on road surfaces, on every landmark that might guide a driver barreling through the French night at speeds that would have gotten him arrested in peacetime. Colonel John D. Groover, no relation to Lauren, was appointed to command the operation. His orders were simple: deliver 75,000 tons of supplies to the front in the first week, then sustain deliveries of at least 10,000 tons per day thereafter. He had fewer than 6,000 trucks to do it. The mathematics said it was impossible. "The mathematics," John Groover reportedly replied, "can go to hell." The vehicles came from every unit in the theater. Trucks were stripped from infantry divisions, engineer battalions, anti-aircraft units, any organization that could survive without them for a few weeks. The GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, the legendary Deuce and a Half that would become the symbol of American logistics, formed the backbone of the fleet. It was not the most advanced truck in the world. It was not the most comfortable or the most fuel efficient, but it was rugged, reliable, and available in quantities that no other army could match. American factories had produced over 560,000 Deuce-and-a-half trucks since 1941. There were so many trucks in the theater that commanders could afford to treat them as expendable, push them until they broke, then replace them from the endless stream of vehicles arriving at the beaches. The drivers were another story entirely. Over 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were African-American soldiers, assigned to transportation units that the segregated army considered suitable for black troops. These men had been trained as drivers, mechanics, and cargo handlers. Essential skills, but skills that white America in 1944 did not associate with combat glory. The Red Ball Express would change that. It would demand more from its drivers than many combat units demanded from their riflemen. "You will drive 18 hours a day," the briefing officers told the assembled drivers on August 24, 1944. "You will sleep in your cabs. You will eat K rations while driving. You will not stop for breakdowns. If your truck dies, push it to the side of the road and catch a ride with the next convoy. You will maintain convoy discipline at all times. 40-mile-per-hour speed limit. 60-foot intervals between vehicles, headlights on at night, blackout regulations be damned." Corporal Charles Stevenson of the 3858 Quartermaster Truck Company remembered the moment the briefing ended. The white officers finished talking and walked out. "We all just looked at each other. 18 hours a day. For how long? Nobody knew. But Third Army needed fuel, and we were the only ones who could get it there. So we climbed in our trucks and started driving." The first Red Ball convoy departed Saint-Lô at 0600 on August 25, 1944. It consisted of 132 trucks carrying ammunition, fuel, and rations. By nightfall, it had reached Chartres, a distance of nearly 200 miles, covered in 14 hours over roads that had never been designed for such traffic. The Germans had calculated that truck-based logistics would fail beyond 250 kilometers. The Red Ball Express was about to prove them catastrophically, systematically, and spectacularly wrong. The first week nearly killed the operation before it could prove anything. Trucks began breaking down within hours of the first convoy's departure. The GMC Deuce and a Half was a rugged vehicle, designed for hard use. But not for this. Not for 18-hour shifts at 40 miles per hour, over roads cratered by artillery and choked with debris. Not for loads that exceeded rated capacity by 25%, because quartermasters had calculated that a truck carrying 3 tons instead of 2.5 tons meant fewer trips, fewer drivers, fewer chances for the whole system to collapse. By August 28th, 3 days into the operation, the Red Ball Express had lost over 300 trucks to mechanical failure, engines seized from overheating, transmissions ground themselves into metal shavings, tires blew out at rates that consumed the entire theater's reserve stock within a week. The roads from Saint-Lô to Chartres were littered with dead vehicles pushed to the shoulders, their drivers standing helplessly beside them, waiting for recovery teams that were themselves overwhelmed. We were cannibalizing trucks by the second day, recalled Master Sergeant William Patterson of the 3916 Quartermaster Truck Company. A truck would break down, and we'd strip it for parts right there on the road. Tires, batteries, fan belts, anything that could keep another truck moving. We had mechanics working 20-hour shifts. It wasn't enough. The trucks were dying faster than we could fix them. The drivers were dying too, not from enemy action, but from exhaustion. Private First Class George Thornton fell asleep at the wheel on August 29th and drove his fully loaded truck into a stone farmhouse at 35 miles per hour. He survived. His co-driver, Private James Morton, did not. They were the first Red Ball fatalities, but not the last. Over the operation's 81-day run, accidents would claim more lives than German attacks. A grim testament to the inhuman pace the operation demanded. Sleep deprivation became the enemy that no amount of determination could defeat. Drivers who had been awake for 30 hours hallucinated figures in the road. They saw German soldiers where there were only shadows, French civilians where there was only empty countryside. The army issued Benzedrine tablets, amphetamines, to keep men alert, but the pills created their own problems. Jittery drivers who couldn't judge distances, who braked too hard or too late, who made decisions that exhausted minds would never have made. I saw a man drive off the road because he was swatting at a bee that wasn't there, Corporal Stevenson wrote in a letter home. He was so tired he couldn't tell what was real anymore. The truck rolled twice. We pulled him out of the cab and he didn't even know where he was. Kept asking for his mother. This is what we're doing to ourselves to feed Patton's tanks. German intelligence monitored the Red Ball Express with growing interest and growing contempt. Oberst Heinrich Berker, the transportation staff officer who had predicted the American supply crisis, analyzed reports from reconnaissance aircraft and French informants in early September. His assessment was dismissive. The American truck operation is an act of desperation, not a solution. Our observers report catastrophic vehicle losses, chronic fuel shortages, and evident driver exhaustion. The Americans are consuming significant quantities of fuel simply to transport fuel, a logistical absurdity that cannot be sustained. Their trucks are destroying themselves. Their men are destroying themselves. Within 2 weeks, the operation will collapse under its own weight. The fuel paradox was real, and it threatened to strangle the Red Ball Express before it could mature. A Deuce and a Half consumed approximately 1 gallon of fuel for every 6 miles traveled. A round trip from the beaches to Chartres and back covered nearly 400 miles. That meant each truck burned over 65 gallons of fuel per trip, fuel that could have gone to Patton's tanks instead. At peak operation, the Red Ball Express was consuming 300,000 gallons of fuel per day just to deliver fuel. Critics within the Allied command wondered if the operation was creating as many problems as it solved. "We are robbing Peter to pay Paul," wrote Brigadier General Ewart Plank of the Communications Zone in a memo that reached Eisenhower's desk. "Every gallon we burn on the Red Ball is a gallon that doesn't reach the front. We are stretching our logistics to the breaking point to sustain an advance that may not be sustainable. I recommend we consider halting offensive operations until rail transport can be restored." The recommendation was not unreasonable. It was supported by data. It was the kind of prudent conservative assessment that had governed military logistics since the days of Napoleon. Eisenhower rejected it. "Patton stops when I tell him to stop," the Supreme Commander reportedly replied. "Find a way to make it work." Finding a way meant accepting losses that would have been intolerable in any other context. It meant treating trucks as ammunition, expendable, consumable, replaceable from an industrial base that could produce more trucks in a month than Germany could produce in a year. It meant treating drivers as something close to machines, pushing them beyond every limit that peacetime safety regulations recognized. It meant betting everything on the assumption that American abundance could overcome American inefficiency. By September 5th, the bet was still undecided. The Red Ball Express was delivering supplies, over 80,000 tons in the first 10 days, but the cost was staggering. Vehicle losses approached 40%. Driver casualties from accidents and exhaustion mounted daily. The operation was hemorrhaging resources at a rate that German logistics officers insisted could not continue. What the Germans did not understand, what their models could not capture, was that the Americans had resources to hemorrhage. And in the second week of September, the hemorrhaging would begin to pay off. September 12th, 1944, Somasus, France, 0347 hours. Corporal Charles Stevenson had been driving for 19 hours straight. His eyes burned. His hands had cramped into claws around the steering wheel. Somewhere behind him, stretching back into the darkness for what felt like forever, rolled 147 other trucks of the 3,858th Quartermaster Truck Company, each one loaded with 5-gallon jerrycans of gasoline, enough fuel to keep Patton's Third Army moving for another 12 hours. 12 hours. That was the margin now. Patton was consuming fuel faster than anyone had predicted, his tanks racing toward the Moselle River, toward the German border, toward the Reich itself. Every day, the Red Ball Express delivered just enough to keep the advance alive for one more day. Every night, Stevenson and thousands of drivers like him climbed back into their cabs and drove into the darkness, racing against a clock that never stopped. The road ahead was illuminated by the headlights of the truck in front of him, a 60-foot interval maintained by discipline and desperation, because a collision at these speeds, with these loads, meant fire and death, and a gap in the supply line that Third Army couldn't afford. Stevenson focused on those taillights the way a drowning man focuses on a lifeline. Follow the lights. Don't think about sleep. Don't think about the ache in your back or the numbness in your legs. Just follow the lights. Then the lights multiplied. Stevenson blinked, convinced his exhausted mind was playing tricks. But the lights were real. As his convoy crested a small rise outside the village of Somasus, the road ahead became visible for miles, and it was filled with trucks. Not dozens, not hundreds. Thousands, headlights stretching to the horizon in an unbroken river of light, convoys from a dozen different truck companies, all converging on the same route, all carrying the same cargo, all driving through the same night toward the same destination. "My God," Stevenson whispered. He had known intellectually that the Red Ball Express was big. He had seen the numbers in briefings. 6,000 trucks, 12,000 tons per day, routes stretching 400 miles from the beaches to the front. But numbers were abstractions. This was real. This was an army of trucks so vast that it turned the night into day, so relentless that the sound of engines merged into a continuous roar that drowned out thought itself. For the first time in 3 weeks, Stevenson felt something other than exhaustion. He felt pride. 20 miles to the north, Major Victor Schramm was feeling something very different. He had returned to the hillside overlooking the main road, the same hillside where he had stood 9 days earlier, watching headlights that stretched to the horizon. He had hoped to see signs of collapse, fewer trucks, longer intervals, evidence that the American logistics system was breaking down as German calculations predicted. Instead, he saw more trucks than before. The convoys had grown. The intervals had tightened. The routes had extended, and most impossibly of all, the flow had not stopped, not for a single hour in 9 days. Schramm had checked the reports obsessively. There had been no pause, no gap, no moment when the roads had fallen silent. The Americans had sustained continuous operations around the clock for over 200 hours. "This is not possible," Schramm said, his voice barely audible over the rumble of engines from the road below. "No logistics system can operate at this tempo. The vehicles should be destroyed. The drivers should be dead. The fuel consumption alone—" He stopped, Unable to complete the sentence, his aide, Oberstleutnant Brandt, stood silently beside him. There was nothing to say. The evidence was rolling past at 40 miles per hour, one truck every 30 seconds, hour after hour, day after day, a demonstration of industrial capacity so overwhelming that it rendered German calculations meaningless. "How many trucks do they have?" Brandt finally asked. Schramm laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "How many do they need? They lose 100 trucks a day to breakdowns and accidents. They replace them with 200. They wear out their drivers and bring in fresh ones. They burn fuel to deliver fuel, because they have so much fuel that efficiency doesn't matter." He lowered his binoculars. "We have been thinking about this wrong. We calculated what they could sustain. We should have calculated what they could waste." The German logistics model assumed scarcity. Assumed that every army, no matter how wealthy, operated within limits that could be mathematically determined. The American model assumed something else entirely, that the limiting factor was not resources, but will. That if you were willing to spend enough trucks, enough fuel, enough human endurance, you could move supplies over distances that should have been impossible. The Americans were willing. On September 12, 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered 12,342 tons of supplies to forward depots, the highest single-day total in the operation's history. Patton's tanks crossed the Moselle River the following morning, punching through German defensive positions that had been deemed secure because American logistics could not possibly sustain offensive operations at such distances. The Germans had written the rules of modern logistics. The Americans had just torn those rules apart. The Red Ball Express did not merely sustain itself, it grew. By mid-September, the original two-route system had expanded into a network of dedicated highways spanning over 700 miles. The Red Ball route itself extended from Cherbourg to Verdun. Parallel operations, the White Ball Express, the Green Diamond route, the ABC Hall, opened additional corridors to feed armies across the entire front. What had begun as an emergency improvisation had become the largest motor transport operation in human history. The numbers defied comprehension. At peak capacity, over 5,958 vehicles operated on the Red Ball route alone. They moved in convoys of 60 trucks each, departing every 2 hours around the clock. In a single day, September 29, 1944, American truck convoys delivered 20,417 tons of supplies, a figure that exceeded the entire monthly output of some European nations' logistics systems. Over the operation's 81-day run, the Red Ball Express would transport 412,193 tons of supplies over 135 million vehicle miles, enough cargo to fill a freight train stretching from New York to Los Angeles and back. The Germans watched in something approaching horror. General Major Kurt Brenner of the Wehrmacht's Transportation Command submitted a report to Army Group B headquarters in late September that revealed the psychological impact of American logistics. Our intelligence officers have attempted to reconcile observed American supply operations with known principles of motor transport. They cannot. The Americans are sustaining offensive operations at distances exceeding 500 kilometers from their primary ports. They are doing so exclusively by truck. They are consuming vehicles at rates that would destroy any European army's transport capacity within weeks, and they show no signs of slowing. I have reviewed the figures repeatedly. Either our observations are wrong or our understanding of logistics is fundamentally flawed. The Americans are not operating within the constraints that govern normal armies. They appear to have access to an unlimited pool of vehicles, fuel, and drivers. This is not an exaggeration. This is what the evidence shows. The evidence showed something else too. The German army was starving. While American trucks rolled east in their thousands, German supply columns had been reduced to horse-drawn wagons and captured civilian vehicles. Allied air superiority made daylight movements suicidal. Any German vehicle on an open road attracted thunderbolts and typhoons within minutes. The Wehrmacht's own trucks, never abundant to begin with, had been decimated during the retreat from Normandy. Fuel was so scarce that panzers were being towed into defensive positions by teams of horses. The contrast was devastating to German morale. Lieutenant Werner Ostermann of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division recorded an encounter that became emblematic of the disparity. September 24th, we captured an American supply convoy near Lunéville. 3 trucks that had taken a wrong turn and driven into our lines. I expected to find ammunition or perhaps rations. Instead, I found ice cream, frozen ice cream packed in insulated containers still cold. The Americans were shipping ice cream to their frontline troops. I stood looking at those containers for a long time. We have not had fresh bread in 3 weeks. Our horses are dying because we cannot find fodder. Yesterday, I watched a man weep because he had lost his last pair of dry socks. And the Americans are shipping ice cream. It was in that moment that I understood we could not win this war. Not because of their tanks or their aircraft, because of their trucks. Because they have so much of everything that they can afford to send ice cream to soldiers who have not yet won. The psychological warfare was unintentional but overwhelming. German prisoners captured in September and October 1944 reported plummeting morale tied directly to the visible evidence of American abundance. They had been told the Allies were struggling to supply their armies. They had been told the advance would stall. Instead, they watched endless convoys roll past their positions. Convoys with headlights blazing, violating every doctrine of camouflage and concealment, as if the Americans were daring the Luftwaffe to try something. The Luftwaffe tried. It failed. German aircraft assigned to interdict the Red Ball Express faced 3 insurmountable problems. First, Allied air superiority meant that any German plane that approached the convoy routes faced immediate attack from patrolling fighters. Second, the convoys moved at night, when German bombers were least effective. Third, and most damningly, even successful attacks accomplished nothing. A destroyed truck was simply pushed off the road while the convoy continued, the gap filled within hours by replacement vehicles from an apparently infinite reserve. Oberstleutnant Hans-Joachim Hermann, a Luftwaffe officer tasked with planning interdiction operations, wrote a memorandum in early October that bordered on despair. We have attacked the American supply routes on 14 separate occasions. We have destroyed an estimated 89 vehicles. This figure represents approximately 0.2% of observed American transport capacity. At this rate of attrition, we would require over 700 successful attacks to meaningfully degrade American logistics. Attacks that would cost us aircraft we cannot replace to destroy trucks they can replace within days. I recommend cessation of interdiction operations against the motor transport routes. The cost-benefit analysis is catastrophic. We are losing pilots to destroy vehicles that do not matter. The Americans have more trucks than we have bullets to shoot at them. The trucks kept coming. Corporal Charles Stevenson drove through October with hands that had developed permanent calluses from the steering wheel, with eyes that no longer registered exhaustion as anything remarkable, with a sense of purpose that had replaced whatever doubts he had carried in August. He and his fellow drivers had become part of something larger than themselves, a machine of such scale and power that it had broken the German army without firing a shot. We knew we were winning, Stevenson recalled years later, not because anyone told us, because we could see it. Every mile we drove was a mile the Germans couldn't defend. Every gallon we delivered was a gallon Patton poured into their lines. We were killing them with trucks. It sounds crazy, but that's what we were doing. We were killing them with logistics. By the end of October, Patton's Third Army had crossed the Moselle, breached the Siegfried Line in multiple locations, and was fighting on German soil. The advance had covered over 600 miles from the Normandy beaches, a distance that German planners had deemed logistically impossible. The impossible had become routine, and the men who made it possible were already being forgotten. The ledger of the Red Ball Express reads like the inventory of a nation's will transformed into motion. 81 days of continuous operation, over 6,000 vehicles at peak strength. More than 23,000 drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, and support personnel. 75% of them African-American soldiers serving in a segregated army that would not acknowledge their courage for decades. They drove 135,298,000 vehicle miles, a distance equivalent to circling the Earth 5,400 times. They delivered 412,193 tons of supplies, enough fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment to sustain entire nations. The operation consumed itself in the process. Of the trucks that rolled on August 25, 1944, fewer than 1 in 5 remained operational by November 16th, when the Red Ball Express officially ceased operations. The vehicles had been driven into the ground, engines worn past any reasonable service life, transmissions ground to powder, tires replaced 6 and 7 times, until the wheel rims themselves cracked from the strain. The Army estimated that the Red Ball Express aged its vehicle fleet by 3 years in 3 months. The human cost was measured differently. Traffic accidents killed and injured more drivers than German action. The exhaustion, the speed, the unforgiving mathematics of heavy vehicles on dark roads. Hundreds more suffered injuries that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Chronic back problems from endless hours in jolting cabs. Hearing loss from diesel engines that never stopped roaring. Psychological scars from watching friends die in crashes that no amount of vigilance could prevent. They received almost no recognition. The Bronze Stars and Silver Stars went to infantrymen and tankers, to pilots and medics, to the men who killed Germans in ways that photographers could capture and newspapers could print. The drivers who made the killing possible were invisible, their contribution measured in tonnage rather than glory. But the Germans knew. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the Wehrmacht High Command, addressed the subject directly during his post-war interrogation at Nuremberg. The American supply operation in France was unlike anything in military history. Our intelligence told us it was impossible. Our calculations proved it was impossible. Yet the Americans did it. They moved more material over greater distances at higher speeds than any army had ever attempted, and they did it with trucks. Common trucks, driven by men who received no medals and no glory. These men defeated us as surely as Patton's tanks. Perhaps more surely. Patton could not have moved without fuel. The fuel came by truck. We understood this, but we could not stop it. We could barely comprehend it. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, who signed Germany's unconditional surrender in Berlin, offered an assessment that stripped away any pretense of strategic complexity. We did not lose to American soldiers alone. We lost to American trucks, to American factories, to a system that could produce and deliver material in quantities we could not imagine. When I learned that the Americans were shipping ice cream to frontline troops while our soldiers starved, I knew the war was over. This was not an army. This was an industrial civilization that had decided to fight a war, and it brought all of its industry to the battlefield. We had rifles and courage. They had everything else. Major Victor Schramm, the operations officer who had watched the headlights from a French hillside, survived the war and was interviewed by American historians in 1947. His testimony provided the perspective of a professional logistics officer confronting the collapse of his professional assumptions. I was trained in the German system, which was the best in the world. We had studied logistics scientifically. We had formulas, models, proven methods. Every calculation told us the Americans would fail. Their supply lines were too long. Their methods were too wasteful. They were burning fuel to move fuel, a mathematical absurdity. But the Americans did not care about our calculations. They had more trucks than our calculations assumed possible. They had more fuel than our models could account for. They had drivers willing to kill themselves from exhaustion to deliver one more load. We calculated what was rational. The Americans delivered what was necessary. These are not the same thing. I watched those convoys for weeks. Headlights visible for 20 kilometers. An endless river of light that violated everything German doctrine taught about concealment. We could have attacked them. We should have attacked them. But what would it have accomplished? Destroy 100 trucks? 1,000 trucks? They would replace them in a week. We were trying to empty an ocean with a spoon. After the war, I studied the American logistics system carefully. I wanted to understand how we had been wrong. The answer was simple and terrible. We were not wrong about logistics. We were wrong about America. We understood trucks and fuel and tonnage. We did not understand a nation that would build 100,000 trucks, drive them until they fell apart, and build 100,000 more without hesitation. This was not logistics. This was something else. I do not have a word for it. Perhaps there is no word. Oberst Heinrich Burker, whose August memorandum had confidently predicted American supply collapse, was captured near the Elbe River in April 1945. His interrogation report included a candid admission. I have spent 20 years as a transportation officer. I believed I understood the limits of motor transport, how far trucks could travel, how much they could carry, how quickly they would break down. Everything I believed was correct for European armies. Nothing I believed was correct for the Americans. They did not optimize. They did not economize. They overwhelmed. When their trucks broke, they abandoned them and brought more. When their drivers collapsed, they replaced them and kept moving. They accepted inefficiencies that would have destroyed any army operating within normal constraints, because they were not operating within normal constraints. They had removed the constraints entirely. I calculated that American logistics would fail at 400 kilometers. American logistics reached 700 kilometers and kept advancing. I was not wrong in my mathematics. I was wrong in my understanding of what the Americans were willing to spend to win this war. They were willing to spend everything. We had no answer for that. No army could have an answer for that. The Red Ball Express officially ended on November 16, 1944. Replaced by rail networks that had finally been repaired and expanded to handle the front's requirements. The drivers dispersed to other units, other assignments, other corners of a war that still had months to run. Most never received medals. Most never appeared in newspapers. Most returned home to a segregated nation that had little interest in celebrating black heroes, even black heroes who had helped win the greatest war in human history. But in the files of defeated generals, in the interrogation transcripts of captured officers, in the private admissions of men who had believed they understood war and discovered they understood nothing, in those records, the truth survived. The Red Ball Express had not just supplied an army, it had broken an enemy's will to believe that victory was possible. And it had done it with trucks, with gasoline, and with the bodies of men who drove through the night until there was no night left to drive through. November 1944, a holding facility near Reims, France. Major Victor Schramm sat in a wooden chair in an interrogation room, waiting for the American intelligence officer to finish reviewing his file. The room was warm. Heated, he realized with distant surprise, by a system that worked. The Americans had electricity to spare. Of course they did. They had everything to spare. Through the window, he could see a road. Trucks were still moving on it, not the endless convoys of September, but a steady flow nonetheless. Supplies heading east, toward a front that now ran through German territory. The vehicles had changed. The railways were carrying the bulk of the cargo now, but the trucks remained, a constant reminder of the 3 months when American logistics had done what German doctrine said could not be done. The intelligence officer, a young captain with clean fingernails and a pressed uniform, looked up from the file. "You were an operations officer with Army Group B. Transportation analysis." "Yes." "Your reports predicted that American supply operations would collapse by mid-September." Schramm said nothing. There was nothing to say. "We're trying to understand how German intelligence assessed our logistics capabilities," the captain continued. "For the historical record, your reports are interesting, very detailed, very confident." He paused. "Very wrong." "Yes," Schramm said again. "Very wrong." "Help me understand. You had accurate information about our truck capacity, our fuel consumption, our port limitations. Your mathematics was correct, but your conclusions were completely incorrect. Why?" Schramm looked out the window again. A deuce and a half rumbled past, its bed loaded with crates stenciled in English. He thought about the hillside near Verdun, about the headlights stretching to the horizon, about the slow, terrible realization that everything he believed about warfare was inadequate. "We understood logistics," Schramm said finally. "We did not understand America." The captain waited for him to continue. "In Germany, in France, in Russia, everywhere we fought, logistics was a problem of scarcity. There was never enough. Never enough fuel, never enough trucks, never enough time. We learned to economize, to optimize, to squeeze maximum effect from minimum resources. This was our expertise. This was what made the Wehrmacht effective. We assumed the Americans faced the same constraints, different scale perhaps, but the same fundamental limits. We calculated how many trucks they had. We calculated how far those trucks could travel before breaking down. We calculated the fuel they would consume, and our calculations told us they would fail. But the Americans did not operate within constraints. They operated within abundance. When we would have rationed, they spent. When we would have conserved, they replaced. When we would have stopped to repair a truck, they pushed it into a ditch and brought another. They did not solve the logistics problem. They overwhelmed it. I watched your convoys for weeks. I saw the waste, the trucks abandoned by the roadside, the fuel burned simply to move fuel, the headlights blazing as if you wanted the Luftwaffe to find you. By our standards, it was madness. By our standards, it should have collapsed under its own inefficiency. But it did not collapse. It grew, and I understood, finally, that your standards were not our standards. You were not fighting the same war we were fighting. We were fighting with what we had. You were fighting with what you could make. And you could make more than we could destroy, more than we could imagine, more than our models could calculate, because our models assumed scarcity, and you had transcended scarcity entirely. Schramm fell silent. The captain was writing notes, but Schramm barely noticed. He was still seeing the headlights. He would see them for the rest of his life. One more question, the captain said. If you had known what you know now about our logistics capability, about the Red Ball Express, would it have changed anything? Could Germany have won? Schramm almost laughed. Could we have won? Against an enemy that shipped ice cream to the front while our horses starved? Against an army that treated trucks as ammunition, expendable, replaceable, infinite? Against a nation that built more vehicles in a month than we built in a year, drove them until they died, and built more without pausing? He shook his head. No, we could not have won. Not once America entered the war. We could have delayed. We could have inflicted costs. But win against that? He gestured toward the window, toward the road, toward the trucks that were still rolling east. Against a country that decided to bury us in material and then simply did it? No, we never had a chance. We just didn't know it. The Red Ball Express has faded from popular memory, overshadowed by the battles it made possible: Normandy, the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine. The men who drove its trucks are nearly all gone now, their stories untold, their sacrifices unremembered. History books mention Patton's dash across France without mentioning the 23,000 men who kept his tanks fueled. They describe the liberation of Paris without describing the convoys that rolled 24 hours a day to make liberation sustainable. But in the archives of defeated armies, in the testimony of generals who lost a war they were certain they would win, the truth survives. The Red Ball Express did not merely supply the Allied advance. It demonstrated something that no European power had truly understood: that American industrial capacity, American organizational ability, and American willingness to spend resources without limit had created a new kind of military power, a power that could not be matched by courage or doctrine or tactical brilliance, because it operated on a scale that made such qualities irrelevant. The Germans had invented blitzkrieg. They had perfected the art of rapid mechanized warfare. They had conquered a continent in 18 months, and they had been defeated by trucks. In September 1944, a German major stood on a hillside near Verdun and watched an endless river of headlights rolling east, one truck every 30 seconds, hour after hour, day after day, and understood that the war was already lost, not because of battles yet to be fought, not because of strategies yet to be tried, but because the enemy had revealed a capacity for supply that rendered all German calculations meaningless. They had laughed at American logistics. They had called it wasteful, inefficient, unsustainable. They had been right about all of it. And they had lost anyway, because the Americans had enough waste to bury them, enough inefficiency to drown them, enough trucks and fuel and drivers to keep the convoys rolling until there was nothing left to conquer. The headlights stretched to the horizon. They never stopped.